the ARPA subcommittee to order, the RAC. And we have a not too bad agenda tonight. Just a couple of major items and some approval of minutes, and maybe a discussion on time frame and future agenda items. But first, I do have on the scheduled public comment.
Before you do that, you gotta call us to order.
I did, didn't I?
No, because you got a virtual, remember, you gotta call it by roll call.
Thank you, sorry. I will call us to order, and I will start with who's on remote. Joe, and Sean,
Here?
Tom,
Here.
Chris,
Here.
Mark,
Here.
Jeff.
Here.
Okay, and Mary Ann is here. Thank you for reminding me with remote. So we'll call to order. And so, do we have any public comment from the audience or from anyone watching on Zoom? Nope. Okay, well, seeing none, we'll move on, and, you know, we won't be too formal here if we have a discussion and someone from the audience wants to contribute. So our first agenda item is probably a continuation of what we started before, which is to discuss and define the scope of our RAC role in view of the official charge of it as defined by the select board. And there seemed to be an issue about whether or not our scope would be allowing recommended use beyond ARPA grant funds. And I think our packet has a copy of the ARPA group charter from the select board. And I wanted to focus, before we dive into it, because I was thinking about this too, on some of the language that is right, that's the purpose statement. And I'm just going to read this and read it for the audience. And if you could scroll down to the purpose statement, Jackie. We have 5,
so can I call FinCom to order?
Oh, okay. Go ahead.
Can you call FinCom to order? 7:04.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks for your apologies.
No, that's okay. I was not looking. So the charge, the literal charge, the first sentence says, the purpose of this committee is to serve as an advisory committee to the Reading Select Board for the purpose of recommending allowed use of local and county American Rescue Plan Act, ARPA, grant funds to fund community priorities. So when I look at that, I do not view that charge as recommending allowed uses of anything else other than that. And I think where we all, this maybe we can talk about that, but I think where we were all going in the last meeting was what was in the next paragraph, which is the part that says, shall consider, we shall consider informing its recommendations, input such as, quote, free cash balances, current and future plan debt, the capital plan, and potential additional ARPA grants as may be available from the Commonwealth of Mass. So I'll just start quickly with my thoughts on this, and then I'd like to hear from the board. I'm viewing inputs as not being the scope of what the group is recommending, but rather inputs to an expenditure. And I don't think we can just, for example, if ARPA proposed that some of the money go towards the replacement of the water tower replacement costs, and we all know another input to cover that cost would be debt or free cash or other things that the town has decided. That's how I was viewing that, contributing towards an existing expense, not creating a new spend that would come with some from ARPA and then would say, oh yes, and let's recommend the other input to this be free cash. Like, I feel like that would be beyond our scope. So that's just what I'm going to say about that. Does anyone on the board have anything? And are you Andrew?
Yep.
I'd like to welcome you on here. Thank you.
Thanks.
Go ahead, Mark.
Thanks, Mary Ann. So I agree with you in terms of what the precise words are and kind of separating the paragraphs. As someone who was involved in crafting this, I can speak from that perspective as well. And I think what I had in mind, I'll speak as myself, is that we have a series of priorities as a town. And the ARPA funds may be used towards some of those. And it may be that we look at some things and we say, yeah, that really is a priority, we can't fund it with ARPA, or we don't want to fund it with ARPA, but it's still a priority. And what I want to be careful of is that we keep in mind what those priorities are as a community and what we're trying to accomplish. And I think as we look at free cash, as we look at the possibility of finding additional funds, additional ARPA grants or other sources of funds, I want us to be thinking about, okay, how does that fit into the picture for Reading? My concern would be that if we kind of said, well, million, 7 different projects, we'd come back and as a select board member wearing that hat, I might view that a little bit differently and say, well, wait a second. There are a few big things we got to take care of. I want to be careful we don't whittle the money away. So I'm asking that we take into consideration what these bigger priorities look like, and then use that to help us in allocating the funds here. So I think it's not the same as saying, hey, let's just decide what all the capital planning should be for the town going forward. I think that's a different committee that doesn't yet exist. But what I do think is that our responsibility can and should be to consider what those larger community priorities are, make sure that we're cognizant of them as we decide how we would like to recommend the use of the funds.
Okay, thank you. So you're saying when we're considering, we're not just going to consider, okay, we have this money to spend, we are also going to have this be an analysis of community priorities?
So one of the things that I think is in the
One
charter
second, Jeff.
is to encourage community input in terms of
Community input towards the ARPA money.
community input towards the ARPA money, but then I'll come back to the second paragraph. Consider informing its recommendations, input such as free cash balances, current and future planned debt, capital plan, and potential ARPA grants that may be available from the Commonwealth. So I think if we try to just separate them and say, no, this is just about ARPA, don't worry about anything else, my concern is that we may miss the big picture. And I don't think that's the right thing. Again, if I put on my select board hat, that's not what I would be hoping to get from the group.
Yeah, no, I was thinking of scope. Jeff Corum had some, Dr. Corum had something to say.
Yeah, I wanted to thank you, Marianne, kind of build on what Mark was saying. Suppose that we go out and get community input and they say, the number one priority for the town is this $10 million thing. And we say, ARPA's only $7 million, we're not going to even consider that, right? Let's go do these other things. So I think that would be the wrong output from this committee. I think that we should look at the free cash and say, hey, with $7 million of ARPA plus $3 million of free cash, which we have, we could do this thing that's our number one priority. So that's why I think, including the free cash as something that we need to consider as an alternate funding for some of these things could possibly be important for deciding the priorities. Alternately, if there were a grant available, we say, hey, look, this is something that's really important. We need to get it done. Let's spend some ARPA money on it. We'll be done. Versus, hey, that's something that we could also, maybe we wouldn't get it, this month, but we could start the grant application and get the state to cover something else. We say, well, maybe that's way. So there are a couple of scenarios where looking outside of this narrow, only focus on ARPA money for ARPA things, that we would better serve the town by getting a somewhat broader scope to our discussions.
I mean, I guess before I call on someone else, so you gentlemen are suggesting that it's okay to make ARPA recommendations that are contingent on additional money from somewhere else versus ARPA recommendations that can be done within the bounds of the ARPA money that we have. Because like the example you gave, yes, a $10 million project, well, we can give some amount of ARPA, but it isn't going to work unless it gets the money from the other source. So you're saying it's okay to make a recommendation that's contingent on another source. I guess maybe it depends on, the other source has to be a sure thing, not a what if thing, right? Like, well, we could recommend this if we get this grant versus we could recommend this by combining with free cash, which we do have.
I mean, it's a recommendation. Ultimately, it goes to the select
Right.
board, who will then
Okay.
look at it and say, we like that idea, but we don't like the contingency, right? They could vote something else, but I'm just saying, we need to keep our eyes open on the fact that there are these other funding sources that might or might not inform our recommendations.
Okay, anyone else? Chris?
Thanks, Marianne. I'll reiterate what I said last time. It's the ARPA committee, not the free cash committee, not the additional grant committee. I think if this was 6 months ago, perhaps we have all that buffer time, but it's not. It's March, almost April. I think we have to be laser focused on exactly what we are spending this money for. And to Jeff's point about the 10 million, why would we just stop at 10? Why don't we say $50 million projects, 80, 250? Where is the limit? That's what happens when you go beyond the scope of $7.5 million. I could just start saying, let's fund a hockey rink somewhere. Like, these kind of discussions should not even be coming up. We should have each one of us comes up with a priority of like $8 million, whatever. Someone takes a portion or whatever, someone comes up with 2 million. See where we all meet in the middle kind of scenario. Perhaps 8, 9 different people have all different ideas. But to go beyond $7.5 million, like I said, where is the ceiling on that? And we're going to be spinning our wheels talking about an hour for Chris Haley's hockey rink. Why would we even do that? Like, it's not realistic. And just because someone mentions it in the audience or whatever, we're going to have to take that into account. So someone from there just mentions the hockey rink too. Like, it doesn't, to go beyond the scope, beyond the first paragraph, it should be crystal clear. It's the ARPA committee. This isn't 6 months ago. This is what we should be focused on. I have a feeling that we could run out of time. Who knows what can transpire? We're already behind the 8 ball, in my opinion, and we should just be going forward with the ARPA money. That is it. If other things come up, perhaps we can only fund 500 grand for Birch Meadow, and we need 550. That's reasonable. But going beyond scopes where there's a $10 million project just seems absolutely absurd when 7.5 is going to turn into like 0 before I finish talking. So that's what I got.
Okay, anyone else have a thought here? Go ahead, Tom.
I don't know if this is a compromise in the middle of where people are or not. As I look at this, and I've been thinking about this since the last discussion, I mean, the 7.6, whatever, 7.5, whatever we have is what we have for this bucket. But if I look at it, and it may not be exactly the intent, Mark, with you and Karen, we're trying to look at this, but I do think we have some pretty good ideas of things that are already on these strategic priorities. We already know what a lot of them are. They've been on the debt plan for who knows how many years, right? So, we can consider those things and say, will they fit into a portion of this money? But just to pull something out of the air that might be 10 million, I think is reckless, frankly. I think we've had these plans, these discussions. We know what's on the debt plan, has been for a long time. If we can pay with some of that with ARPA and not take debt, so be it. And then we should probably leave a portion of the bucket for maybe smaller community type things, but not big ones. So if we were to say, we know free cash, but I personally think that shouldn't be what this conversation is about. That's what financial forums are for. That includes all 3 major boards and 4 if the Board of Library Trustees joins us as well. And it's specifically focused on looking at free cash and debt planning and things that are much bigger in scope than the ARPA, the Reading ARPA Advisory Committee is. But those things can be inputs to our process because we've already vetted them for a long time. Whether that is the field house at RMHS, whether that is Birch Meadow. Birch Meadow's gone for a long time not being attended to, but it is something we've had on the priority plan for a while. So are there portions of that we can do with this? We already know from select board conversations that water and sewer is a problem, and that's a big problem that frankly will also lead to expenses for the individual taxpayer out there for the long run if we don't address it. We also know from the school committee perspective that literacy and high school stuff are big problems that we want to try and figure out how to do. I think we need to think about it in a little bit different way than, are we looking at everything in maybe a different way of how are we strategically allocating these funds? What is our strategic vision for how these funds can be allocated, and how does that pay us back in some way, shape, or form? There might be a portion of it that we just put for fun projects. I think Bob said, I hope you spend some money on fun projects before we left. But I think most of it we should be looking at, how is this going to pay us back in some way, shape, or form? How is it going to be an investment that drives savings in the future or that drives additional income in the future? In the case of water, it could save the individual taxpayer, their water rates in the long run, right? In the case of school stuff, from a literacy perspective, it could save us out of district placements. It could save us a lot of other things in the long run, right? So in the case of Birch Meadow, or in the case of RMHS or things along those lines, it could save us debt and debt payments, especially with the inflation that's going on right now. I know our rate is pretty low, so if it stays zero, then zero is great. But if that starts going up, it saves us the debt payment. So we need to I think we need to look at this more strategically than, let's say, ollie oxen free, well, let's bring everything in the bucket. We have already a bunch of things in the bucket. How do we want to take those things in the bucket and prioritize them? And then maybe a small portion of that can be set aside for greater community priorities that are the small wins that people might see. A garden here, a bench here, put the traffic dummy back in the middle of town, as some people would want to see, whatever it is. It can be more of a small win type thing as opposed to the big strategic wins. I think the great majority has to be big strategic wins for all the parties involved, but there might be a few that are small wins that we can hit. But input-wise, using that, there are inputs there that we can absolutely use, and we should use, because we shouldn't just come up with priorities that we've never discussed for the last 5 years.
Anyone else have go ahead, Mark, you want to speak again?
Thanks. Yeah. Thanks, Tom. I think all good and interesting ideas that you brought up, and I think that many could make sense here in terms of kind of finding common ground. I just want to clarify a couple things. One is that strategic, I think, is the right word here. But I want to clarify, the community really has not had input into capital spending, other than a list that the prior town manager had kind of put forth, and items that make it to the capital plan. So if I look at the activities at the field house, Birch Meadow, senior center, fun, none of those are on the capital plan per se. None of them have numbers and aren't in there. So I think if we ended up restricting ourselves to what's on the capital plan, we'd be missing a lot of the things that we really probably want to look at here. As a town, we only have so much money, whatever pocket it comes out of, whether it's the ARPA pocket, the free cash pocket, the capital pocket. They're all the same pair of pants, if I can use that analogy. People can't pay for everything and or don't want to, some combination between the two. So I think that thinking about kind of how all this fits is an important part of what we're going to do. And it may be that the right choice is to come back and say, look, let's just kind of fit into these pieces. But it's got to fit in that bigger scheme. And I think that if we view this as lottery winnings and let's just go out on a trip, that wouldn't be the best use of the funds here. And I'm not suggesting that's anything that anyone said. I just agree that we want to be very strategic in our thinking here.
Okay. Just when you mentioned something about the capital list, it was something, I was reading the charter today, and under the section 7.7 of the charter, it says, the town manager shall submit a capital improvements program to the Board of Selectmen and Finance Committee at least 30 days before the date of the budget, et cetera, et cetera. The capital improvements shall contain a summary of contents, a list of improvements proposed to be undertaken during the ensuing 5 years with supporting info and cost estimates. So you mentioned that we don't really have input and we just get it from the town manager, and it sounds to me like it's done that way because it's specified in the charter that the town manager comes forth. I mean, Fidel, do you have input on that? Do town managers conventionally seek input on their capital projects that enter the plan?
Yeah, I think
Community input?
I think all communities do it differently. I'll say that. I mean, I think the capital plan is really developed by professionals, right? So Joe Huggins, he knows facilities and the needs, right? Our police chief knows the vehicles that are needed in his fleet. Our fire chief knows, the assets that are needed on his side. I do think, though, that there is an approach that we can take, right, and it's being modeled by the the permanent building committee, where we invite, right, the local experts, if you will, right, into the process. So Pat Tompkins and his committee, over the last 6 months, have really partnered with Joe Huggins and his team, right? And they've done an analysis of all buildings, and they've prioritized, right, what is needed from a building standpoint. So what I'm saying is that the process is correct, but we could invite input, right, from the local experts in the future. I mean, and I think the overall project and the process is better at the end.
But it sounds like somebody is already doing the heavy legwork to tell us if something is shovel-ready and what it would cost. And if we said, oh, would this be an ARPA candidate, if the community said something was an ARPA candidate, you would say, oh, look, it just happens to be on the list and we know how much it would cost and how planned out it is or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, at the end of the day, if we allocate $2 million to the school department, right, Tom Milachowski's, his charge and his job is to implement and to execute, right? So on the town, it's exactly the same. The staff and the professionals are going to be the ones that execute, and if we give them something that is not realistic, right, or is really hard to execute, it might not have the best end result, anyways.
So in terms of what this group does when we're prioritizing, it sounds like we could decide to say, well, we could stick with some things we know, we can take overall community input, make a list, and then give it, either we come out with a recommendation or give things to the select board and they choose which, and they may choose something from the capital plan or something that our committee came up with. But it is good to know that we have professionals who've kind of done something more than we're all capable of, and quite frankly, that what we're going to have the bandwidth for. And that leads to something I maybe was going to show the group, but I don't know. Jackie, I had sent you an email with a table I was preparing. Did you get that email?
I did. Also, Joe has his hand raised.
Oh, yes, well, before that, yes, absolutely, because we should get Joe, because Joe has to leave at 8. I'm sorry. Go ahead, Joe.
Sorry, I have my conflict, but yeah, just quickly, going back to like what Tom said, I think there is like a compromise, hopefully, because I'm just struggling with like all the, the management information, right? Because I see like, whether it's like capital, we have the capital debt plan, we have water, we have school literacy, right? I think it might be helpful just to come up with that like list. I don't know, maybe it's just like that to me is like the big list, and then there may be things that say, okay, well, some of those, make sense, right? You defer to the expert, like, like the building committee, like you move things up, like you use this money and, change how things are ordered, like, say, in terms of the debt schedule. Like, I'm just curious, like, how much is missing? Like, do we already have, like, 60, 80%, or we quickly put together that list, right? And that to me is like the complete list, right? Can we find it all and have all that? Maybe there's some things that just jump out from there, and then on top of that, maybe the nice to have that, kind of come out of more conversation. And then, like, going the other way, I'm trying to reconcile my mind's thinking, but then, like, top down, I still think of it as, like, how are we allocating, like, that 7.5 million, and, what is the, back to what Mark was saying, what is the strategic, thought behind this, right? Are we, do we do it that way, right? We say, okay, we're gonna say 20% goes to X, 30% to Y, right? But I think before we even get there, I'm curious if there's just some things that might kind of jump out from that, like call it that bottom-up analysis. So it may not be articulating as well as Tom, but I just think that I don't want to get too bogged down, like building lists and everything, but I'm really curious, like how much we're really missing, right? In terms of, where we are. It sounds like, Mike, you thought that there's a lot of other things out there potentially, but I'm just wondering,
So Joe, can I ask, so are you saying we probably know how we're going to spend like half the money or something like that.
I just want to jump to that, but I'd rather say, are there some things, right, I guess to the point, what else said, are there some building things that would say, you know what, this is going out like 5 years, but we would ideally want to do this sooner, like there's risk to this building, blah, 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 right? Or on the water side, there's savings for the ratepayers, right? We do something quicker, right? But I think just bottom up, trying to get it. I guess there's some low hanging fruit, just from looking at that list, and then I'm so curious, like, what isn't there? And there's probably some things like, Tom mentioned, like school literacy, right? That are maybe they're not that well publicized. At least I'm not aware of them, but I'm sure there's other things out there like that too. So.
Okay.
But again, creating that, whatever that master list is, that we could maybe pull that together quickly before the next meeting and figure a way to then, sit through it. Just throwing it out there, so.
Okay, we have an audience question. Chuck? Oh, I'm sorry. Sorry, thank you. Go ahead, Mark.
So I think one of the assumptions that it sounds like we're talking about is that everything here is capital. And I'm not sure that that's necessarily the case. Many of them are. Many of them are, I think we probably would take a quick poll and find that a lot of people would say, gee, we want to do one-time expenditures, much more so than anything else. But still, not everything there is capital. I think that there are things that we probably could put onto that list. I'm not sure that that's, I think individually, we're going to end up definitely doing that, no question. I'm just not sure that that master list, as kind of a starting point, is the right way to go. It may make more sense to kind of find out what everyone is thinking about for different kinds of ideas, and then talk it through that way. And I agree with you, Joe, it's both top-down and bottom-up in terms of what's going on. I'm just trying to think about what might be the next step, and to the extent that we're saying, okay, it's capital and it's already on the plan, I think that that's overly limiting. I think that's not necessarily capturing all of our priorities. And I don't want to kind of get down that path and then have us say, well, we've got the list, but certain things aren't on it, and then it gets more complicated. I'd rather kind of have a process that says, look, here are the things that we want to talk about. We'll see where there are areas of discussion, agreement, disagreement, and then we can figure things out from there. I think it's more individual than group to start.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess my own concern would be like the timing to go through that process, right? If you already have indicatively what are the master list, and again, some things may not come out of that process by itself, but then somehow encourage or layer in, okay, what are the things that are missing that people want to bring up? I don't know. Just a thought.
Chuck, did you have a comment?
I can speak louder. You want me to go?
Maybe just for the people watching at home.
Yeah.
If we have an audience out there.
You could switch the camera for Chuck.
That's all right. I don't have a tie.
There he is.
I thank you, Chuck Robinson. So I don't know if I'm coming over, but and I say this respectfully. I really don't think this committee should draw value judgments on how the money should be spent. I think the committee needs to figure out how to divvy up the money and let the staff, the town, led by the town manager and the superintendent, go back to their committees on how they would like to spend their. I'm not trying to oversimplify it. I just really don't think, without a lot of input from a lot of people, this committee can draw value judgments on how this money should be spent, so.
Yeah, no, I think it's you can get community input, and just like any other community meeting, it's about, well, who decides to come and participate, and
Right.
what are the dominant voices. I understand.
So, thank you.
Okay. So I'm gonna show the committee something I was looking at, and I'm gonna fill more of this in for next week, when I think we would probably all take a vote. So this table, I'm sorry, the writing is so small. I started looking at some nearby and roughly nearby communities with what they're doing. And there's various extremes, and it seems like it's dependent on the amount of money. And we also have to realize, we're not one of these communities with 80 million, with 50 million, with 35, 40 million, where there's a lot of choices and a lot of impact. It's not that much. Like on my list, Acton and Wilmington had similar amounts of ARPA money to us. And at the top, Acton there, they had an interesting breakdown, and it wasn't just capital. They called 1.7 million for equity-focused services, and when you drill down into it, it's benefiting disproportionately impacted students in the schools. They had money for town and school first responders. I'm sorry, that's Arlington, I mixed up. They had money, school district money, some money for infrastructure, some money to address negative economic impacts of COVID, for public health response. So those are, as Mark would allude to, non-capital things. That's an example of something, and that was, they didn't have a dedicated subcommittee to do it. If you scroll down a little bit, Wilmington on the bottom, they're just taking all 7 million, it's going towards water stuff. 5 million, they apparently have a big water main project they want to use it for. And I wasn't able to get the input on Tewksbury 9 million. Fidel was telling me it's something similar there. And then you get to the other extreme, and this is where I'm worried. I'm worried we will get to, if you look at Brookline. Brookline had some group that spent 20 weeks with, it said 15 focus groups, surveys, lots and lots of input. They came up with this 49-page paper, which I linked to, and they still didn't even define the money. It was just priorities. And the priorities were, interesting priorities. I worry that we would come to that point and still not have something and spend 5 months. So I'm going to try to get more things, get Linfield in here and Wakefield by next week, and it'll be in a packet if we care about comparisons. But I guess my point is that, just looking at how much time we have, a little more time with this. I think next week the group should take a vote on maybe it just spending ARPA or trying to have broader priorities, because we can run into, a long time frame. I mean, this group can extend as many times as they want, but this isn't that much money. And it may be, as Mr. Robinson said, departments are itching, they have the need, they know what they want. I think it might be useful to maybe hear town departments sooner versus later, just to know what we're dealing with, with the schools, have them in at some point. So the other chart I wanted to show, and this is probably going to lead more to how we would divide things, is a chart that Fidel developed, some of you may have seen, about an example way to divide the money. And I'm showing this now because something like this would really, I'd like your thoughts about how this could simplify our process. Because if we say, okay, these departments are getting things, then we're kind of just focused on the 1.25 million, which is, smaller, but then that can be lots of community things. And maybe that breakdown of money isn't right. But when Fidel showed me that, I thought it was just interesting to share with the group. It doesn't mean we have to do that. But it's it's attractive in its simplicity because it's leaving some things up to the groups, but it gives a picture. It gives it something we can do in a time frame. So before we move on to the agenda item about how we would divide things, does anyone have any thoughts about more use about the scope of our group, or, because we can't take a vote tonight, it's not noticed, but I think, do we agree we should take a vote? We haven't heard from you, Sean.
Marianne?
Yep.
Andrew has his hand raised.
Okay, I've just called on Sean, then Andrew.
Okay.
So I'm all for simplifying the process. I think there's just two things we do have to, we do have to keep in mind. The charge does exist. There's only so much we can sort of choose internally to overrule with respect to the charge. So we do, the charge does say the committee shall gather input from the broader community. So we do have to build that in at some point, even if we sort of go to kind of a simplified approach, we'll need to build that in. And maybe a split like this, you'd focus the 1.25 million on.
Or whatever that
Sort of community
number is,
gathering,
right?
yeah. The other thing I'll say, for the folks that are concerned about sort of, does the scope stop at what we recommend, what's sort of within the $7 million number, I just want to call out that there's one sort of very real example that I don't know, I don't want to speak for others, but I don't think folks would balk at, which is the $2 million for the water tower, that up to $2 million for the water tower, the town meeting requested, recommended, I don't remember what the exact language was. That inherently is a project that's broader than what we would be funding with the ARPA dollars, right? So if we were to be comfortable with that project, we're on some level already recognizing that part of this conversation will inevitably include things that might be bigger than what can be funded out of the $7 million. So I agree with the sentiment that, Chris was, sort of arguing in the extreme, that we shouldn't think about a $250 million project and here's $1 million now, town, go figure out the rest, right? That's probably not the right way to think about it. But where I hear commonality and we've all sort of been talking past each other for these last two meetings, but where I hear commonality is that I think we all agree and recognize that these recommendations aren't going to happen in a vacuum, that some of these projects are going to have been contemplated for other funding sources already, that some of these projects are going to be anticipated to show up on the capital plan in 2, 3, 4, 5 years, whatever, and that some of these projects might be projects where there's already identified funding and this ARPA funding would only be a chunk of it, like at the water tower, for instance.
That's the example. That's going to happen whether or not we fund it.
Right.
It's already planned whether we take debt.
Right.
It's the concern about the contingency. And
Yeah, and I don't think it's in this committee's best interest or in anybody's best interest for us to go out and get a wish list of, $100 million capital projects and say ARPA is going to contribute $1 million towards it, right? But if there are things that, could be accelerated or could potentially be started earlier that we probably likely would otherwise fund or that we likely would otherwise identify sources for, and we can accelerate that process for things that rise as priorities by contributing some of the ARPA funding, I think that probably feels like it could and should be in scope. So, I heard a lot of talking past each other. I think if we were looking at real examples, like the water tower is $7 million, but we're not going to spend $7 million of ARPA, just as a hypothesis, but we're not going to spend $7 million of ARPA, I think we might all say that's within the bounds of reasonable discussion, right? I think.
Yeah.
I think we would also say if it's net new $250 million, so let's throw $1 million at it. Well, that doesn't move the needle. What's the point? We can include that on the list of things that were surfaced as community priorities, but we're not going to sort of waste our time talking about how much ARPA money we should use for something like that might emerge.
Okay, Jackie, you said Andrew McLaughlin thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sean. Appreciate that input. I'm kind of on the same page. I just want to clarify, the ARPA also kind of acts as, from my understanding, also kind of acts as almost a quality control measure to ensure the town and the finance committee are bringing, the community needs as a priority, right? So a lot of times when it comes to allocation of funds, you have three main categories. That's development, sustainment, and improvement, right? And then those get prioritized based upon the professionals within each one of those departments, saying they need X now or X later, right? So ARPA, after reviewing the attachment, ARPA would kind of also offer not only the input from the professionals in their trade, but input from the community saying, this has been on the docket for 15 years, we need to move this up, or we'd like to move this up. And they have the ability to bring that up as a discussion or put a recommendation in, correct?
I think so, yeah. That's.
Okay. This kind of sounds like, when talking about capital, a lot of times, like we were just talking, capital spending is based upon, the professionals' input, and then the presentation to the town and the finance committee for a 5-year capital plan. But sometimes you have certain scenarios, or the community might have some specific need or desire that they may want to arise to the town and to the finance committee and to ARPA. And then that's where ARPA might be able to voice a stronger opinion, correct? Or am I missing that?
And I think so. Okay. I thought, Chris,
Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Yes, thanks, Marianne. In terms of the water tower with the, for that example, it's 192 people already made the decision for us for that. It was already vetted by them over, I think it was like 2 days or whatever. So that one, while it is under the 7.5 million, was already vetted and discussed. So for an example, I don't think that one would be that crystal clear that it would be if that discussion didn't happen. And then I'd like to commend Fidel because he could have saved Brookline 20 weeks with just creating this, because I don't know what they did when you just came up with this in a meeting. Just seems, pretty amazing, just seeing how it's split up there. I'm not saying that we're going to end up going that route, but just seeing it up there, it seems reasonable. And then going out of that to go to 3 million, 5 million, any other number, just seems like you're taking away from everything else that could be up there. So I'm not even sure how or why we're going to discuss anything over 7.5 million. With this breakdown, none of that math will ever work at all. And I have a couple ideas for the 8 o'clock hour thing, and none of them are on any of the plans that have ever been discussed. So.
Okay, go ahead, Fidel.
So how this was developed essentially is that at our first meeting, right, it was very clear that that there's things that we consider important, right, and there's things that we want to get some input from, right, and we all agree that we should define buckets, right, and the buckets are meant to be kind of like tiers of priority, if you will, right? So in my 6 weeks of being, in Reading, 3 things really come up, right? Athletics is really important to the town. It's sports, it's athletics, it's the fields, it's the field house, Birch Meadow. It's every conversation that I have with residents, and I think at this point I've talked to probably not 192 people, but close. Then water and sewer rates are high, right? That's always coming up, and we need to find a way to either hold the pain a little longer, right, and last a little longer, or defer the pain to a future date somehow, right? And the last thing is, of course, is the school priorities that keep coming up. Investing in our young children, finding ways to provide short-term benefits that are going to have long-term savings, right? And what I try to do here essentially is divide into buckets, right? And my vision essentially is that on the water and sewer bucket, I think that's something that we have experts on, right? If we ask our treasurer, our town accountant, if we ask our DPW staff, if you had $2 million, what's the best way to save money on the rates? And I think if we ask them that question and listen to what they have to say, then it's more of an educated conversation. Well, on the school priorities, essentially the same thing, right? But on the school side, and on the athletics, we have a recreation department, we have a rec committee, right? I mean, and they talk about these things like almost every day. I think if we do this and then we limit the scope of what we're asking the community, right? Because it could be a bench at a park, or it could be a speed bump, or it could be maybe a funding some a speed up of our senior center process, right? I mean, I think if we early on set these buckets, right? I think it's going to help our conversations in the end.
So you're saying the buckets, even if if, to the point of Dr. Coram and Mr. Doxer, we look at larger priorities that we could contribute to if this subcommittee goes that way. It still would be in a framework of, does it fall into one of these kinds of categories? So I guess that's a way to combine it. Go ahead, Tom.
Just a point of clarification on that last point. My understanding from what Fidel just said is not that this committee would then consider all of those things, right? But rather say, these are the 4 big buckets, water and sewer, go figure out how you're gonna spend that and come back so select board can say yes, right? Schools, go back and figure out how you're gonna spend that and come back so select board can say yes, but this is the recommendation. Athletics and recreation, go figure out how you would spend that, come back and say yes. And then the greater discussion of the greater community discussion of other things that may fit into that 1.25, or if it becomes 2.25 or however it breaks down, right? That's where we say, community, how else do you want to spend this money? These 3 big buckets we're pretty confident in, and it allows those groups to go off and do what they need to do, and get that money, spent and or, locked up by end of 2024 so that it can be spent by end of 2026. But here's the 1.25, here's the 1.75, here's the 2.25, whatever that magic number is, that is actually open for further community discussion. And I would also say this, I think this committee probably should put some sort of rules in place for that spend, right? Or recommended rules, since it's not our official final approval. But the spend should be one-time or project-related short-term spends, not funding full-time positions or things like that will cost us in the long run and we'll have a cliff over in the future. So whether that's projects from a capital perspective, or whether it's purchase of something that is a one-time purchase that is going to be used for a long time, but it's a one-time purchase, whatever that may be, we should think about that kind of container as well to what this money is spent as.
Agreed. I mean, you'll say, if the school department is to use any of these funds, right, in the summertime, then they will need a decision quicker than the fall, right? I mean, we are setting water rates probably in April or May, right? I mean, and if we're to use any of these funds for FY23, that decision has to be sooner than the fall.
Go ahead, Tom.
And just to build on that, I think that's where the urgency that some of us are expressing in this meeting over time is exactly that. If there is a spend that has to happen over the summer, if this is going to complement another spend that we already have grant money for over the summer, but it will actually make that grant money more worthwhile, which is what the literacy one is in particular, then we need to make a decision on this, or ask the select board to make a decision on this sooner than later, and not let it just linger. And October is too late for some of those things. The ship will have already sailed. So the sooner we can make some of these and move some of these forward, the better off we'll be actually saving in the long run and improving things in the short run that we need to do.
I mean, that kind of dovetails into something at the end of our agenda that I alluded to briefly with the community input timeframe, because I think do we want to say we won't spend anything until we get community input, or if we get, whether it's a town or a school department or some compelling time-sensitive use. And I've seen that in my research. I didn't get Sudbury into my chart, but I know Sudbury, for example, in January approved money, like hundreds of thousands of dollars for their summer schools, because it was a time-sensitive ARPA spend. And so I guess I'm trying to think that this is that kind of topic. It probably ties into the scope of it, because the scope could be, we could give this select board short-term recommendations and long-term recommendations, but we need to hear from the schools, the town, other groups, like say your Recalc didn't have money for the consultant, you have it, but say you said, oh, we need this money now, like that kind of thing. So does anyone have an idea for a mechanism? Go ahead, Sean.
Well, I think part of the beauty of a framework like this one is that it provides guardrails for those different organizations and different bodies that might request money, right? So you could take the $1.25 million in the upper left there, just as an example, and have that be the focus of the community input sessions, right?
Which can wait.
Yeah,
a little
I mean,
bit.
a little bit. I mean, I think we still sunset later this year, so we still have to keep moving the ball forward. But, to Tom's point and others, on the school side, if there are investments that we can make this year that are going to help us start making a dent in literacy challenges next fall, that will have a better payoff than us waiting another school year to do it. And so, I think that's some of the beauty of a framework like this one, is that it does provide those guardrails and allows us to maybe move a little bit more quickly on some of the urgent priorities that are already pretty well vetted, which probably exist across the board. Certainly on the school side, I think we've got some that are fairly urgent and relatively well vetted.
I think Karen Herrick is on Zoom now. Which means that.
Karen, do you want to call us to order?
I would love to call the Reading Select Board to order. Thank you, Sam.
Thank you.
Did someone have a hand up? Okay, well, Chris, then Mark.
I guess in terms of, I don't know what the school priorities are, obviously, but in terms of like the literacy programs that you are advocating for, are we talking it's $20,000, or do you know what the dollar figure is?
I mean, it's not 20,000.
I was going to be like,
They got a
20,000 seems as if we should all just say yes now and then move on.
So, Sean and I had our weekly with Tom earlier this week, or Dr. Milichewski earlier this week. And our intent, if this kind of framework comes forward, or if we say, let's talk more about this framework on Tuesday, is to come with a little bit more about what that $2 million would do and what we think that would be, right? So hopefully we're ready for Tuesday to do that. Literacy-wise, there are many things that are necessary to roll out a new curriculum. You have to actually purchase the curriculum.
Professional development.
Right, we only have 200,000 from the state for that. It may not cover what we need to purchase, right? You have to have professional development around that curriculum. You have to have professional development around the core underscore of what the curriculum is being implemented for as well. You probably have to have short-term coaches to help implement the curriculum appropriately as well, right? These are some of the things we've learned from the incorrect or incomplete rollouts of things in the past that we're actually doing really well with illustrative math this year, is having that kind of framework and structure in place so that when you roll these things out, you actually have success, right? So all those things add up. Will they equal 2 million? Maybe not, but if you throw in high school pathways and we decide we're going to do, CAD programming at the high school or something like that throws something else in there, right? So it all is a matter of how can we absorb it in the time frame and how can we then forecast it out. And Susan's on the call too, but I know that Tom and Susan have been working through, a multi-year forecast of when we want to do things. So that might play into this as well in terms of when some of those items become available.
So the 2 million is a realistic number. Obviously, you could have 100 million and you'd spend it all, but the 2 million is a realistic, short-term, very long-term investment that we'd be able to make.
I think I'll speak for the collective for the time being, but, Sean can speak up, Chuck can speak up as well. I think we can very comfortably spend the 2 million properly, right? It's not going to be wasted. It's not going to be something we're just, going to do something. We could probably very comfortably spend 3.5 million properly. But I think 2 million is a good, framework to start with. If it becomes 1.5, if it becomes 2.5, we can obviously, ebb and flow and say what would come in, what would go out as a result of that. But from a compromise perspective, I think 2 million is a good number that sets us in good place for some of our core initiatives, but also then make sure the town is in a good place for a lot of the town's core initiatives as well. I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Yeah, like I said, it's more of, I don't understand the school priorities in depth as you would end up knowing. So it's hard for me to rationalize the 2 million there, but then hearing what you would spend this on, it seems reasonable. It just seems like this stuff that me and I'm sure other people here are going to be like, I have no clue if this is going to make a difference, but if the people involved making the decision say, absolutely, this is gonna impact us and save the town money in the long run, I mean,
Yeah.
you know, that's why you guys are the.
I mean, just to, I'm sorry.
Well, Mark had a comment, and then, go ahead.
So I just want to be careful here. One, what we're talking about really isn't on the agenda at all at this point. But number two, I think we've got the cart pretty far ahead of the horse suddenly. People are talking about numbers and what they ought to be. That's not tonight's activity. So I want to be really careful of that, and how we're going to vet that really is, I think, what we're going to be working on. So I want to be really careful.
Well,
that
we're
we don't
moving
come
on to the dividing of the 8 o'clock agenda item. I think we're gonna take a vote on the scope, but now we're the options of the format of recommendations. So I would say that is on the agenda. I know that I gave examples of lists and splits, and we're talking about buckets. And it sounds like part of the format could be short-term and long-term recommendations. I mean, I'm just looking, say, schools and town each needed some money now. You know, we have a meeting on the 29th, and we have a meeting on April 12th, and the next select board meeting is April 19th, and then there's town meeting, and then it isn't until May. So just hypothetically, say there was some spend we all agreed on now, and we could vote and say, well, let's get, you know, a first recommendation out by April 12th for some summer money for the schools, and maybe there's something for the town. It's not gonna get spent until you gentlemen and the ladies on the select board vote to spend it. And that may not be until May, and then you start saying, it could be April, could be May. Is that too late for the urgent spend that we wanted to make? So I guess part of this 8 o'clock now, the second real substantive discussion we're having, a format of recommendations. I mean, I think we're all kind of leaning towards the buckets, but now there's the timing of the buckets. Is it like end buckets, early buckets? Maybe we all can, how comfortable are we with making short-term commitments? And if we make them, can the select board execute on them? Go ahead, Mark.
So, okay, let me kind of go piece at a time. So, one, I don't think we're deciding size of buckets tonight, no matter what.
No,
We're
it's just
discussing
buckets is a
options and
format,
structures,
but.
right, and buckets, I think, I think we talked about it even last time and even before. I think buckets is definitely the right approach in terms of how we're going to take this. In terms of short-term, long-term ideas, I think they still are going to need to fit within the buckets. It's just an issue of kind of when we may be making some of those spending decisions. You know, which ones are clear and known and impactful now versus those that maybe they need more vetting and other things as well. So my concern is that, you know, suddenly everybody sounds like we're you know, here's a number, let's go with it, and we're not there yet. So
Well, no, I
just
think
wanna
we
be
need
really
to hear
careful of
from,
that.
like, what I was thinking is hopefully in our next meeting, if they're available, that if the schools have an urgent summer need and they can present a compelling reason, they ought to tell us so that we can recommend it. I mean, I guess they could bypass us and just go present right to the select board too. I don't know.
Or to
if
town
there's
meeting,
anything
for that matter.
Yeah, town meeting doesn't,
Town meeting doesn't have the spending authority on this money.
right, I mean, they could just,
Not of ARPA money, but of money in general.
Right.
So, you know, a project that comes up that's an urgent need for the community, ARPA is a source of funds. There are others also, and that's kind of my point in this overall
Well,
discussion.
So say something went before town meeting, though, town meeting's voting on the fiscal year '23 budget. Can the schools wait till July? Say they needed something for the summer, can they wait till July 1st? If they were trying to take it out of leftover fiscal year '22 money, I guess they could come to FinCom for our reserves up to a certain amount, and then maybe some transfers, they're not on the warrant. I don't know the particulars of how, if the schools suddenly want to ask town meeting for extra FY22 money for a summer thing, that in town meeting, that is hard to do, I think.
Sorry, this isn't actually where I was trying to go.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
So I apologize if we're going down the wrong rat hole here. I think that by thinking about this strategically, figuring out the buckets that make sense, this is in fact what we've been talking about. I think that's a great approach for us to take, figure out what they are. In kind of general terms. Then I think the next thing is going to be figuring out what's a suggested allocation of things.
Yeah.
It's fine at that point for people to be thinking about, okay, these are the things that would fit or not fit as a result of that activity. And then again, some of them are shorter term, great. Those probably should come to the select board sooner than later in order to use that. If they really are, things that need to happen, I'm going to stay clear of town meeting for right now. I just want to make sure that we have a process whereby we don't go, again, same thing, and we kind of say, okay, here are the short-term priorities, great, let's do them. And now actually the long-term priorities, well, they're bigger too. This pool of money is not going to grow. So if we're staying inside the scope, I'm a little, I think this is great. I think I truthfully would have preferred to see this as X $million in one, and Y $1 million in two, and Z $1 million in three. Sorry,
You mean
I'm out of
like
alphabet.
something without actual numbers, just some placeholder?
A structure for us to think through. I don't think we're in a position to say, how much goes into each
And
of
I
the
think
buckets
these
yet.
were just suggestions, like, they were almost an even division, but not quite. Jeff,
But I think we haven't, it's hard to say, it's hard to even think about what they should be without thinking what goes inside them. And I think in any one of those categories, we can come up with massive numbers if we wanted to. We're kind of taking our scope down. I don't want to have the suggestion that we've already decided how it's going to go, and it feels a little bit like that's where we are. And that's not a comfortable place to be.
Okay, Sean, you had a comment? Or Andrew, I'm
Andrew,
sorry.
go first, yeah.
Just say, I agree with Mark. We're not at the point of like assigning dollars and spending money at this point. I do agree in general, sitting on the money isn't going to get us any benefit. Spending it sooner is generally better than sitting on it for a long time and thinking about it. And having been through a lot of public processes here, I think we could have 20 meetings like Brookline, and you won't learn anything more than you would in 2. Especially if we do good online outreach, do the right things, we could get public feedback in a big hurry. Going back to, I think it was Joe's point early on, we should have a sort of a general list. I think we're pretty close to having a general list of people's top priorities. I think it would be helpful to sort of see numbers next to some of them, because, like you say, seeing 2 million is a nice round number for the schools, but if maybe 2.1 is the right number when we sort of see what the cost of those things are. Maybe it's 2.2 for the water and a little less for athletics. I think if we get each of these groups based on the buckets we have here, and with public feedback, maybe there's another bucket that should be included, I don't know. That's part of the process, but I think we should accelerate our process, do it as quick as we can, including public input, and sort of get numbers assigned to these things, and then we can really sort of say, okay, let's talk about the buckets, let's talk about the priorities. And I think the public, especially if we had those numbers, then they could give real feedback. It's, we could maybe hear everyone say like, oh, absolutely, Birch Meadow is my #1 priority, or, do the water tower. But I'm generally in favor of sort of accelerating the process as much as we can, and putting some numbers on these, and then start to, then we're really in a place to talk about divvying up the buckets.
Just so I understand you, for the public input part, because I like your ideas, are you suggesting public input for how much each bucket should comprise money-wise, or what's a priority within the bucket? If we define the buckets, or let the public
I'm
define
not
the
sure,
buckets, I guess.
yeah, I think putting out numbers and projects and the general concept of buckets and see what people say about it. I'm not sure what, again, we're just starting on this thing,
Right.
so I'm not sure.
But no, I think, because we're going to move on at the end of the meeting, kind of,
Yep.
to discuss community input, and maybe we'll have a
Yep.
little more time for that. Sean, you had a comment?
Yeah, I agree with Mark and Andrew. The numbers are probably going to be wrong that are up here, right? But there's also a chicken and the egg thing, where I think it's very helpful to have something as a directional starting point to say, water and sewer team, go think about what $2 million-ish would look like, right? If it's 1.5, if it's 2.5, to the point that I think, Mark, you made earlier, then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about what are the trade-offs, and we'll use potentially community input to do rank ordering of some of those things. It's very helpful, I'll speak for the school committee, it's very helpful for us to have a starting point, because to Tom's point, we have a lot of things that we think we could, spend really effectively on and really help our kids. And if you gave us $2 million and gave us $20 million, we'd probably have an answer for you, right? So having a number as a starting point, again, we may come back with 1.5 or 2.5 once we actually sort of, measure things out. But I think having that as a starting point is a really helpful way to think about the scope of the priorities we should be identifying, and the scope of the things that we could be funding, in relatively short order. again, from my perspective, I recognize that these will probably not be the final allocations, but I think they're useful as a starting point to say directionally, go think about what a couple $1 million would look like in this category, right? So.
I mean, it could all be that plus or minus, 10 or 15% or 20% even. Okay, I was turning my head, so did I miss any hands raised down this end? Jackie, anyone on the Zoom or in the audience?
No.
I mean, so it sounds like we're all, I'm sorry? No. It sounds like we're all. No hands?
No hands.
So it sounds like we're all leaning towards the buckets approach, and I had listed, I guess, there's buckets, and then within the buckets, there's going to be a list, and the list may include items that exceed the amount we think that bucket should be. So I'm trying to think, for our next meeting, if we get some community input for other than the community priorities, which we'll talk about, how do we get those? Do we want to put out two groups, like the way Sean put it? What would you do with this amount of money? Or we're thinking of giving, your department, some proportion, probably maybe equal to all the others of the ARPA money, and they can figure it out. Like, how would we approach them? To say, here's your inputs. I mean, because if you tell them 2 million, they'll come up with 2 million.
I mean, I don't want to speak for, well, Susan's on, maybe Susan can weigh in, but, if you were asking me and I were both Dr. Milczewski and Susan, I would say, here are the top priorities. They're $1.5 million, $1.7 million, 2.1, whatever it is. And here are 2 or 3 other things we think are important and valuable and justified under the ARPA, now we're in this sort of replacement revenue place, but, justified under the original ARPA guidelines, and these should be part of the consideration as well. And that's where we'll have to, that's where we'll have the trade-off conversations. I mean, that's how I would answer the question if it were posed to me as an individual. And I think that's probably a reasonable starting point for this discussion. And then, I know we'll get into more about the community input, but we could, we can hold that bucket for the things that aren't identified within these slices of the pie.
Go ahead, Mark.
Thanks, Ryan. Just to build on what Sean was saying, I think that can make a lot of sense. I think it would be helpful to both kind of build up a list in certain categories, but also make sure that there's some vision toward priorities that we're seeing. And I'm going to pick a specific example here for a moment, which is where, if we talk about senior center activities as a specific item, some of us might say, well, that's going to fit community priorities, and that one's going to wait. We're going to get a lot of input on that. The flip side of that, I think, would say, maybe that's right, but maybe that category now has to be more substantial in overall size, because as we look at that list, we see, well, there's this, and there's affordable housing, and there's, I'm looking at your list now as I can read it, and sidewalks, and road repair, and a variety of things. And that list, may get, quite substantial. We can all figure out how to spend the maximum amount of money that is available. That's not going to be a problem. The issue is figuring out where the right priorities are, and how do we trade off A versus B, and how is that going to fit? I think we need to start kind of, maybe with a build-up. I don't know that in a week's time we can reasonably do that, but it shouldn't be, it's not a month either.
Well, I mean, I think we probably have, assuming we get the people here, we know the superintendent could probably tell us some money spent, a facilities person. Fidel, would facilities be water and sewer spend? Like, who would come talk to us?
I would.
You would? Okay.
DPW.
Yeah, I would. All day, every day.
And then, okay, Chuck, good.
And it's up to the chair, but I would think that the superintendent would want to have the committee weigh in on what he's recommending to this committee before he.
So he would need to know.
So
You
that would
got,
have to be,
it's too late to put it on,
right?
yeah, you have tomorrow's agenda, and it's too late to put it on that, unless.
I mean, maybe not, but I'm just, I probably wouldn't, as a chair, just bring something without running it, but I don't know. Maybe, but that's up to
So would it be more reasonable to say April 12th would be a time to say, let's have input, you know, maybe from the schools, we could get all the inputs don't have to be the same night.
Disagree with you if you don't, I mean.
I'm waiting for my turn to talk, and then I will.
Yeah, no, I'm responding back. Okay, go ahead.
I mean, I think all the things that we put here are things we've discussed as a committee already. It may not be the priority, it may not be the spend necessarily that we've discussed, but all of them are priorities that we've discussed. They've all come out of the findings that Dr. Milichewski put out in February. They all have been discussed in some way, shape, or form with regards to the overall budget and things we didn't get to get in there as a result of it. But it may, and, you know, the urgency with regards to the new grant that we just got as well is part of it that the committee's all aware of, right? So I don't know that I think that, and this is not binding necessarily either, right? So this is how theoretically we might spend this money. Like Sean said, there's 1.5, there's 1.7, there's 2.1, here's 2.5. And ultimately, yes, the committee has final authority if it comes back to the school committee. But I don't think it's out of turn or out of alignment with what we've already discussed as a greater committee. If something were to come out of left field, I'd be surprised. I don't think anything's going to come out of left field that we haven't already heard about.
Chris, go.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, I think the only left field stuff's going to be the 1.25 ratio, that section up there with the community priorities. I don't think like a new, you know, a Killam field house or something is randomly just going to come out of this when the Birch Meadow stuff's been there for a decade, which then would fall under the athletics. So, yeah, I think we should come up with the pie chart bucket scenario of what we think. Have the, you know, if Tom knows that Dr. Milichewski is going to come back with XYZ, then he can come here next time, or Tom can present whatever he has. They're going to know the school priorities, not me. The same thing with water and sewer. Like 2 million, I don't know if that covers like half of Walker's Brook, which is, I don't know, what was that, 400 grand or something like that? But where's all the other money getting spent? I know there's 5 years worth of projects or whatever that's out there, but that's why we have these other people that are going to be able to give us the input, the guidance, and we can just see. It's more of the community priorities that are going to be the wild cards out there with whatever various things. And I'm not sure the back pay actually fits into any of these scenarios for the essential workers, et cetera. So, you know, that's another piece of a pie chart that's not represented up there to consider.
I would argue that's a community priority, but that's my opinion.
For me, I wouldn't see that. It's more of, it's going to be something. I don't think the community would weigh the hazard pay over a new XYZ instead. I don't know that would ever come up, but, you know, perhaps I'm incorrect in that assumption. But that's why I think it would have to be a fifth item up there. And does the schools also fall into that pay structure as well? Is there essential workers that?
We have received requests, yes.
So.
I mean, it was a little different because they didn't work through the whole pandemic, but some did.
Some did.
Yes.
Quite a few did. Quite a few did.
So there would have to, yeah, there's going to be some ratio, percentage, et cetera, that I think should be represented up there as well. But that's just my.
Go ahead, Mark.
If I could just add, so the other thing to consider is that if this group were to recommend somewhere between $0 and $2 million toward the water tower, the water tank, excuse me, that's not really thought through here in buckets at the moment either. So I think what we're going to have to do is come up with these buckets, maybe prioritize within them. And just, you know, you said, for example, maybe the number's going to be different by 10 or 20%. Maybe it's going to be different by 50 or 60% too. I think that's
depending what we consider is in the bucket.
Yeah. So I think that we're going to have to be flexible, but I think getting these ideas, see what they are, see what the priorities are, is going to be the most helpful thing to get us started. And then we can go through it and see, you know, where do people think it should go.
So do we as a group feel comfortable if we had lists of things, like putting them into buckets or asking the departments to say, or I guess we have to start by having the definite set of buckets to start with. I don't know that that's a vote, or we're discussing the bucket format. I guess we could all hash out now. Do we think these are the buckets? Do we need another bucket? Any thoughts?
Andrew?
I don't think the buckets are key. I mean, we're gonna have a list of top priorities in each of these categories. You can almost then mush them together. It doesn't, we're not necessarily gonna say, like, oh, I have to put 2 million to sewer, water and sewer. If that doesn't make the top list of our real priorities, then maybe it goes way down. So I don't think we have to talk, the buckets are sort of a nice concept, but it's really gonna be the individual list of top priority projects that we're gonna sort of look at.
So the list will give rise to natural buckets that come from it?
And we know what the
versus
buckets
starting
are,
a
but
bucket?
yeah, and if there's something that doesn't fall into any bucket, like the hazard pay,
And it starts in the community priority bucket, at least,
Yeah.
if it doesn't create a fifth bucket,
yep.
right?
It could be, and just, in terms of framing and looking this way, then I would argue the community priority bucket probably needs to be substantially larger than the demonstration version.
Yeah, I'm not completely hung up on the bucket concept at all. I think when we see the list of what the top priorities are, that adds up to $7.5 million, that's what we're gonna sort of go towards. And then see where the buckets fall out.
But the buckets help us start the discussion at certain points of expertise.
Yep.
Right?
Yeah,
So if there's another bigger bucket from a point of expertise that we want to add,
right.
right, that somebody else wants to bring to the table, then now is maybe the time to ask it, so we know which group of expertise to go to.
Right.
To get that feedback, right?
Yeah, I think it's go to each of the departments, so go to the schools, go to the water and sewer, go to all the town departments and say, what are your top priorities to spend on, I think we know what our general rule is. It's gotta be a one-time thing, it's not a new position.
So that raises a good question to me, and I'd like the group feedback. Who is the one, is it Fidel and then Dr. Milashevsky, the one that goes to the town departments, not this, either this group calls them before us, but no one in this group should be tasked to go
No.
gather that input. We should just be getting it through the town manager.
Yep.
Or through the superintendent, so we don't have to interact with staff. We can invite them here. So do we think about, with timing for this, I mean, we have our next 2 meetings up, and then, I had something in front of me because of the select board.
The 29th and the 12th.
The 29th and the 12th, and I was just looking with April, we have the election, April 5th. There's a select board meeting at a certain, what did I just say? It was 19th. So, but town meeting's in the middle of everything. Do we think before town meeting, there are some things this group wants to nail down? And that, maybe I'm getting ahead of the community input timeframe, because that, we need to get that in there. And I don't really see community input unless we come up with a survey happening before town meeting. I don't know if anyone has if anyone's been through a community input process in our group for some major item.
It's different.
You have with Park
Yeah.
recently.
I was just gonna, thanks, Marion. I was just gonna give my example on Park. It's more of what I'm seeing happening here. It's just the instant replay of what happened in Park. It's meeting. We finally got to the where we started in the beginning. We finally got there, halfway through it kind of thing. And the longer that this is going on, the more that I'm picturing in my head, there's no way we're coming up with stuff by this next meeting. It just doesn't seem feasible at all, the way that everyone's input is coming through. And I'd hate to see us get off track and get our hopes up that, this is the priority that has to happen now, let's get it done. It sounds great right now, but I don't see it being realistic. And I hope I'm wrong, but just from gathering input and seeing it, I hope it doesn't go down that road, but it's already there, and,
Well, by the next meeting, we could certainly be starting to building our priority list is a tangible thing. And it seems like it's something that we can do over the next couple of meetings, even if we don't have the amount set, as well as dedicating some time to say, okay, what, should we have an online survey with the community? Definitely a, some kind of a public meeting, but what is the best way to reach the community? I mean, that can happen while, like during town meeting. Not like a survey, not an actual meeting that gets in the way, but that could be happening in the background, assuming we know what we want to ask them.
Yeah, the survey route, we got over 1,000 on park and whatnot, and that was through various outreach. I think the big asset that we have is the new Reading website, where we'll probably be getting more traffic by people checking it out. So perhaps utilize something on there, a landing page immediately, like we're looking for your feedback, et cetera. I don't know if I'm making recommendations now, but it just seems like the majority of traffic in Reading for the town's website is going to be like over the course of this next week or two, which is unfortunate that we don't have that time to put something together. But
Well, I don't know if you know this, but we do have our subcommittee does already have a page on the town website. I already found it, so, and we're all listed. All right, well, I think we're getting a little bit, we got a little bit ahead of our agenda item for the options for the format of RAC. And I think we're coming towards, we're gonna have lists within buckets of some varying amount that could end up looking like a pie chart, depending on how, it'll stop looking like buckets, it'll start having more wedges. So I guess now maybe we're into the community input time frame and formats. Formats and types, when I say to be discussed at a future meeting, I was intending to mean, developing the questions, because I thought something for a survey, we could all maybe contribute to that, whether it come to a meeting with something, or maybe there's a Google Doc that we create. I know it has to be a public document. How did you guys develop your survey in Park? And Mark, how are you developing it in Recalc? Because I'd like to learn from what people have already done.
you want to go first?
Sure. So, well, with Recalc, we had the benefit of a grant and hiring a professional firm who has done this for a number of other communities. So they're going to be doing a lot of the actual implementation. In terms of the questions and things, we went through and developed a list based on the membership in the group and soliciting other groups in town, most specifically like Council on Aging, which would have a lot of input into things. And that's how we kind of developed the starting list of questions, and then to be implemented through the pros. That said, I do a lot of work with surveys in developing them and putting them out, and would be happy to participate in helping on that front.
Yeah, I mean, just as long as it's a survey that, gives room. Do you think it's worth it to have open answer responses as well as fixed responses, or is that going to create a lot for us to weed through?
I think one open answer response at the end.
What about your thoughts, Chris?
I would agree with the open-end thing, with just having the one at the end, yes. So Park, we brought all of our ideas to a meeting, went over all of them as a group, and then whittled them down and kind of fine-tuned, like, this sounds great, let's modify it a little bit to just include X, Y, Z, and then we came up, I think, something that fit on the single sheet of paper is the idea, because, for this, it seems a little bit different, though, because it's only going to be priorities, or it seems like it'll be smaller in general than, I think we have like 36 questions or something like that. I don't think we're going to end up with 36 questions on here. I think the big one is going to be the one at the end, like, what, additional feedback.
But I also think if we lead them a little right, and we have something, and you say, can you rank these? Like, well, there's going to be ranking questions.
Yeah, we
that
had
would
that as
probably
well.
be easy to ask.
Mhm. We can all come here with questions for a survey, and like I said, perhaps 4 or 5 of us all have a similar one. And now it's only one question, so you're not, when someone looks at a survey and sees 36, it's like, I don't know about this. If you got 15, absolutely, with one at the end that you can fill out and whatnot. Just remember, when you get the input at the end, if we got 1,000, that's a possibility of 1,000 paragraphs that someone is going to have to go through.
probably
It
all
can be
of us.
key,
Yes.
they can be keyword searchable to say, okay, how many times did someone say, schools or sewer or things like that? Did you have a Sharon?
Yeah, so two things. One is, I don't want to underestimate sort of the skill it takes to write a good survey, right? A poorly written survey can skew your results, number one. So, I know Mark has some real-world experience. There are techniques you can use to write a survey if we're expecting a large number of responses. If we think realistically we might get in the hundreds of responses, there are techniques you can use which don't expose all of the choices to every survey taker, but ask them to trade off this versus that, and this versus that, and this versus that, and then the compendium of those responses gives you sort of the true rank ordering when people are actually considering the trade-offs. Would I rather do that for 500,000 or that for 800,000, for instance? So I would encourage us to think about not sort of just writing here's a list of 17 things, rank order them, and then what did we miss? Which I think might be the default sort of scenario we'd run into in writing one of these surveys. And think about a way that really sort of tests preferences. Like there's a lot of good science behind this. It's how car manufacturers evaluate what to put in certain packages, right? Do people care about the electronic or the remote start more, or do they care about the better radio more, right? Like, there's real science behind how you can do this, and it's not actually that difficult, but it requires a little technical know-how, and I think we'd get better results, truer results that indicate the preferences of residents if we think about kind of a structured approach like that.
Okay, I guess, Mark, then Chris, will be reverse.
So I think for today, we talked more about just kind of the time frame more than anything else, as opposed to the specifics.
Oh, right.
Because that's, right, well, I'm
But
thinking.
we need to come back to it.
But I'm thinking, okay, could we all have come to this group with a couple of survey question ideas by the 12th? I mean, Tuesday may be too soon, or maybe it isn't, and the 12th is too late, because what do you think?
I think we need to do it for next meeting.
Next meeting?
At least something, right? I mean, and it may not be perfect. It's not going to be the first time around, right? It's going to have to be rinsed and refreshed a little bit and said, well, does this make sense? The way Sean's talking about it is good, but I think the sooner we get that going, the more likely we're going to have something that's usable immediately after town meeting, which I think is what we really should be thinking about, is how do we get data for that meeting that's going to be immediately after town meeting, right? Otherwise, we're going to punt this another month, and that just takes that much longer, so I think we need to, demonstrate that urgency and say, what can we do to prepare ourselves for, next Tuesday's meeting as a collective about how to do some of that stuff. I would also say, and Chris, I'm sorry, I think you were supposed to speak next. I think I spoke out of turn. I don't think we should limit ourselves to surveys. I think we should, I don't know if this body has the ability to call a public hearing, but I think we should do something a little bit more public as well. Not let anybody dominate the mic forever, but, give a 2 or 3 minute window, hear from people that may have other ideas.
That's why I called it community input, because it
exactly.
covers different things.
But I think it's a little bit more than public comment at a meeting, but at the same time, we want to make sure we moderate that well, but we have the chance for them to come before us.
Excuse me, I'm going to deputize Mark to be chair for a second, because I have to run to the ladies' room. I don't know if this happens in meetings, but this is why.
Temporarily, if you want to.
Does anyone else need a quick break? I'm drinking soda, so.
We can take a quick break.
What?
We can take a quick
Let's
break.
take
Okay, let's take a
temporary adjourn.
temporary break.
Talk later.
I think when we left off, we were discussing bringing back survey questions for the 29th and also considering other types of community input, a possible forum. And do we have any thoughts about timing on that?
Sorry, timing on,
A community forum
oh,
as well, like before, like after the survey, contemporaneous with the survey, after town meeting? I mean, you've got April vacation. I feel like it would be hard. You've got the senior, we don't want to compete with the Recalc one.
right, right.
I would say
I think at whatever meeting we're going to point to bring back and discuss the survey results, I think we could also have that serve essentially as the community input session. And it would
That's a
include-
great idea.
It would include both the survey results and anybody who chose to come speak, either to reinforce something they said in the survey or to introduce something new or whatever. And we just have that all as part of one discussion rather than multiple timelines of input.
So then we have something to present to them. And
Right.
then, someone will say, well, I never took that survey.
Yeah.
So-
Yeah.
So that-
And again, even if they did, I mean, it might, to Tom's point earlier, somebody may just want to give a 2-minute pitch for, I suggested this in the survey, and let me tell you why it's important, right? And I think that would be the opportunity to do that.
Okay. And so maybe we're thinking an early May timeframe then after town meeting, because town meeting, I think, keeps going away on me
We
here.
can always have more than one as well. If the first one is
Yeah.
well-attended or nobody shows up, I mean, you kind of,
I mean, it could be in between the nights of town meeting, but I think that pushes it for people.
I think you
Yeah.
can advertise it at town meeting.
You actually,
Yeah.
yeah, it's a great point. You could advertise it at town meeting.
Yep.
And do it,
That's
very
how we did
shortly.
the park thing, is advertising it at the street fair, the survey kind of scenarios.
Can I say just one thing too, that I've become very sensitive to kind of how the different formats we allow for the survey. Not everyone has internet access. Not everyone's going to be comfortable doing it that way. So having places where people could fill it out, maybe at the library, at the senior center, things like that, and just advertising those as options. I think that will be more inclusive.
How easy was it when you guys had the postcard with the QR code? Like, could someone just, like Whiteland Books or somewhere, just scan it and take a survey on their phone right there? Is that how?
So that's what I was going to bring up to Mark's point, is having the digital survey and radio buttons and all fancy schmancy ease of use and all that sounds great, except you have to have this available in a paper format. So your ranking and everything else that's going to look fantastic online is going to be horrible in print, and we have to offer it that way. I don't know what the ratio was of printed surveys compared to the digital ones. I'm sure we could get that info. I could email Bernie and find out. Maybe it was 20 paper ones and 980 for digital, but we still have to offer it.
And it has to work in both formats.
Correct. It's
That's the hard
like
thing.
online, you can make it look all amazing and everything can work out, but when it comes to paper, it might not just be feasible, depending on how you want to word the question and whatnot.
In the good old days, they were able to do it without heavy computer lifting and stuff. I think we can figure it out.
I mean, I think other than the open response and reading someone's handwriting, everything else would probably just be coloring in a dot and
Yeah, that's why
or
you
circling the
mentioned,
choice.
yeah, onto the size-wise where someone isn't overwhelmed. It's when you see a question and you're like, rank these, and it's like 18, like your one question just took up half the page. So it's more just being cognizant of that, is what we kind of whittled things down to make it fit within a page or two. But the QR codes, I don't know how, once again, how well received that was, what the analytics would be on that. We might as well have them regardless, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's, some people, their only internet access might be their phone, I suppose, some,
Or they may not have it at all.
yeah, that's, and Tom, the schools, Tom and Sean, I should say, Chuck, the schools did their surveys, I think on, Dr. Doherty might have run them in the past on the remote learning, and I remember seeing responses where here's what the teachers preferred, and here's what the students preferred, et cetera. Was the school committee involved at all in devising those surveys?
Nope, we were not.
Nope, so it was just all the superintendents doing?
Yep.
Sure.
So, and I don't know, maybe there's no time for, but you mentioned, Mark, that you did that survey cost? And can you use some portion of the ARPA money to run the survey for you?
I'm just going to repeat the question for the audience. So Mr. Robinson asked, he asked, could we use some ARPA money towards the cost of a survey of spending the ARPA money? And then he was asking Mr. Doxer, what was the funding source for the Recalc survey?
Funding source for the Recalc survey was town meeting. So they actually allocated some funds. So for the entire project, including the expertise and the analysis and the survey being one small part of it, it's $40,000. But a survey itself is a small fraction of that.
Which is really all you need, right? You don't need the other parts.
I don't think we need the analysis, certainly, right. But kind of figuring out how to do it, what to do. I would also argue that simple is going to be usually the better and best solution here. Conjoint analysis, which I think, Sean, is what you were kind of laying out, I do not think we want to go
That'll
there.
be hard on paper. I'm sorry, Dr. Coram had a comment.
I've just noticed, I think the Finance Committee has dropped out of quorum, so I will move to adjourn the Finance Committee. Are we still at 5? Because we lost one in the room.
Yeah, no,
I
because
moved
Joe
adjourn
had
the
to get
Finance
onto
Committee.
a call. Okay.
Drew is still online.
Who?
Andrew,
Drew is still online?
but that's 4.
But not Joe.
But not Joe and not Jack.
No, not Joe.
All right, you can go home now.
Thanks for coming in. Can I offer a couple of
Thank you,
suggestions?
Jeff.
Yep.
No, I'm just saying, go ahead.
One, I think the idea of maybe thinking about the kinds of questions we think would make sense, each of us, is probably a good thing just to get us started anyway. Might not be the final point, but it's a good starting
Yeah.
point. The other thing is that if I could jump back to earlier in the agenda, I wonder if we could also kind of come back and start thinking about items that we're thinking about. So some of them were listed on that chart, but it may be that there are other items that we should kind of gather and think about what is it that people are thinking about already. And maybe we can fit them into buckets. And maybe we find some don't fit neatly and we've got to talk about them. I think that'll kind of push us down the path a little bit of what people are thinking about. You know, it feels like those are actually 4 maybe pretty good buckets. But there may be, one bucket that's immense and another that's pretty small. And we'd
Would you
still-
say what people are thinking about? You mean people on this committee?
Absolutely. I think the purpose of this committee was to get a cross-section of the groups in town, the appointed and elected boards.
Okay, well, that actually is probably a good question to make sure we have answered. Jackie, could you please put back up Fidel's slides, since we're just going to talk about what maybe is missing and should be added, so we can look at it for reference.
Actually, I was suggesting less, so you're talking about the right-hand side. Sorry, I was thinking not the left, but the right, just in terms of some of the items that are already listed there. Maybe we want to flush those out a little bit further.
Okay, well, either way, we needed this for reference.
Yep.
So why don't you lead us off with an example, since you think that there's,
I think Mark was suggesting it for next meeting.
oh, next
Yes,
meeting, I'm
next
sorry.
meeting. Thank
Okay.
you. Yeah.
So for future agenda item, in addition to our homework on survey questions.
Yeah, this is the other homework.
So the first homework, I'm just gonna note down, is survey questions, and the second homework is adding to the starting point buckets, or whatever we wanna call this.
Or maybe it's creating a list of items that we think should be considered.
Yeah, I think it's getting a start on a working list of items for consideration.
So adding/creating working lists of items that should be considered and might fit into buckets.
Yeah, we won't finish necessarily next time, right? But we'll need it as an input to start thinking about how the survey is constructed.
Yep.
So.
Okay. I think that's good. Now, we had talked briefly about hearing inputs from any town people that might, contribute to these lists. Fidel, do we think that there would be anyone, either you would have information or someone would need to come to speak to us about, items on this list that we may not have the expertise to know to add? Like within water, sewer, or facilities, or something like that?
I would love an opportunity to talk water and sewer on Tuesday. And I'm pretty sure that Dr. Milichelski is ready as well on Tuesday.
To talk water and sewer?
To talk water and sewer.
Yeah.
So that's.
It's all water and sewer at the end.
That's how they detected COVID. Anyway.
Well, that sounds like that gets to be, the order, I can be flexible about, maybe have the presenting people sooner and end with the survey stuff maybe, but that sounds like a full agenda then for next meeting.
Absolutely.
Can I suggest one more thing?
Sure.
So I'm hearing two things that we want to come out of the next meeting with. One is sort of a starter working list of the items, for consideration, right, which may inform the survey construction. Second is at least an understanding of what are we trying to achieve, what are the objectives, what are pieces of information we're trying to get out of the survey, right? As a second thing, I don't know if we'll write the questions per se, but at least understand what we're trying to learn from it.
Question topics.
Question topics, sure. And then there's maybe a third thing, and Tom was alluding to this earlier. Are there any criteria that we want to develop as a group, just as sort of a North Star as we go in? So, there was a suggestion of project-based or one-time, I might extend that to use the phrase time-limited, but, so something around that could be an example, and it's not on the agenda today, so I don't want to keep going, but are there other criteria that we would want to identify that we should sort of think of as our North Star to kind of, rein in the creativity that may otherwise emanate from all kinds of different sources, so.
Yeah, I know, I remember in our first meeting, I had some ideas
Yeah.
for criteria, so that's good. And then, don't forget, at the start of the meeting, I had suggested at some point in our next meeting, we would just take a vote, and if we think a vote is necessary because I don't think we've reached agreement on defining the scope of our role. I think we're all definitely in agreement of, yep, we're gonna come up with the 7.5 million. There was inputs about, whether it's contingent spending or some combination, like you mentioned, the water tower fits in. Do we think we need to have a vote on that, or just do we feel like we're in agreement and how proceeding? And it's kind of weird that I'm saying let's take a vote on whether we need a vote, but we started off in our first meeting with more disagreement than I think we're reaching now on it. Any thoughts?
I think when we start talking about real things, we're closer together than we are far apart, right? It was when we were talking in the pure hypotheticals that it was easy to construct scenarios where one person might agree and one person might not. But when we're talking about lists of real things, it's going to be easier to say, that's probably not a good fit for this because ARPA funding doesn't get you far enough down the path or whatever. I think we'll end up being closer together than we are far apart, and I don't personally see the need to vote on some refinement.
Maybe also, but by setting the criteria, that will be a filter. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that Sean's right. I think, if it turns out that there is something that kind of veers off, we're going to hear about it. But I think in general, it sounds like we're seeing what we want to do.
Chris, go ahead.
Thanks, Marion. Yeah, I was going to agree with that, only because it seems like we already have the money spent. It's like, I don't see where the $20 million project is coming into when you see a ratioed breakdown like that, which, isn't out of left field where it's, 7 million school priorities. Like when you really break it down and realize that, these different groups have to be represented that should be getting a portion of this money if we agree with that, I just don't see how any of, my hockey rink is going to be coming up out of nowhere. It's just, yeah, no, sorry, Fidel.
If I could just add, I think, there may be discrete chunks that are doable of Chris's hockey rink as an option. But the hockey rink itself is probably a lot more than
a study for a rink.
Yeah.
The snow cones at the rink is more likely.
You say that. When I was looking at what other towns were doing, imagine this. We don't have it, but Weymouth is turning one of their extra school buses with ARPA money into a mobile food pantry.
Huh.
Like, that's a creative use of money. They have the school bus to do that too, but that's kind of an out-of-the-box retrofit. Someone came up with that idea. It's solving a problem they have.
That is out of left field. A school bus.
The Mass Municipal Association, if you put the word ARPA in, you start getting links to all the stories, and that's where I saw, that usage. So who knows what people will come up with. Okay.
Better than a hockey rink.
So I think we're maybe slightly ahead on the agenda. I want to just think about future meetings, because we have the next two, but did this group agree on,
Do you want to stick to your order, or do you want to, because your next order is the approval of minutes before future
okay,
agenda items.
yeah, we can approve the minutes beforehand, thank you for reminding me. But I think we want to also get a meeting in beyond the 12th. So does everyone have, either online or in a packet copy, the minutes of the meeting? Have you all?
Could you pull up the minutes, Jackie, just so we can see this? Thank you.
It was in the agenda, yeah.
Yeah. Great job on the minutes, Jackie, too, there.
Jackie
Always.
is awesome.
We're so
She's
spoiled
killing
with
it.
her. Thank you, guys. Good night.
I think we all have them, right?
Yep.
We all have them,
Yep.
so, and she's
Yep.
bringing them up for the audience.
Oh,
Do you want a motion, or?
Yeah, I mean, does anyone have any before we take a motion, does anyone have any comments on the minutes? No, okay. So I will, as they say, I will entertain a motion.
Move to approve the Reading ARPA Advisory Committee minutes from March 8, 2022.
second.
Okay, thank you. So, Sean seconded. Jackie, we don't have any, ARPA members online, right? Joe's not on? Okay, so, do we want to approve by raising hands? Okay. Thank you, all approved. And so then the last item is thinking about some future meetings. I think just maybe, we got as far as April 12th, then I know there's school vacation and town meeting, and maybe if we can lock in the first May meeting. And now I see town meeting is still meeting May 5th, so.
I thought we'd settled more or less on Tuesdays on the off weeks for select board.
Okay.
Wasn't that sort of the,
Is that still
repeating pattern
okay
we
with
landed on?
everybody's schedule? Because we settled on that, but Mr. Grimes, you weren't at the meeting. I know you have Board of Library Trustees on Mondays.
Yep. Yeah, it's only Mondays.
And we also settled on that because FinCom was active in April, in March, so Wednesdays theoretically become more available.
But is Recalc still meeting on Wednesdays, certain
Yes.
Wednesdays?
Yep.
So I just have the select board schedule in front of me. So, for example, they're meeting May 17th and May 5th is annual town meeting. So between the 5th and the 17th is possibly May 12th. And I don't know.
I think it's the 10th.
Is it the
10th?
10th?
Tuesday.
May 10th.
Okay. Do we want to look at that as our first meeting after town meeting? Because it feels like a big break between April 12th and May 10th. But I think by having the excuse me, March 29th and April 12th, we'll get a lot done, and maybe we'll even have, I don't know that we'll be fully ready for a survey, who knows? But I don't see us being able to meet before May 10th.
Is there any meeting on May 11th? I mean, I only ask because I generally attend CPAC meetings, and I've given them up for March and April for this. So I can give up May as well if necessary, but if no other meetings on May 11th, I'd prefer to do May 11th.
I'm open that day, that night, sorry.
That's a Wednesday.
I am as well.
School committee is meeting on the 9th of that week. CPAC is the 10th.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think Tuesdays generally work, but that particular one, May 11th, I think Recalc hasn't claimed yet, so. maybe we
Yeah,
take
I
it
mean,
first.
the town calendar doesn't list anything. Well, then, we can say,
I don't
May-
think anyone's planned this far ahead.
I
That's what's
know,
on the
but I guess
calendar.
it's just, come on, pen.
We've got our whole one all the way here.
Yeah.
We're good.
Well, that's why I'd like to see that we're taking this initiative to really going, because we're already into May, and like,
Yep.
as far as I'm concerned, the two future meetings have already happened, so.
Well, we'll work, we have homework for the next meeting, and I'll make sure, I get something out from Jackie that goes to all of us. Maybe I'll try to get the agenda so we have to get it soon, right, Fidel?
We
Because
should publish an agenda tomorrow.
tomorrow, okay, so I will have my homework to get the agenda done tonight, and Mark, I'll share it with you, and Chris, make sure it looks okay. I'm still working with the time estimates. I was almost okay there.
Did great.
I hate
It's
giving 10
8:53,
minutes
we're
for
ahead of
something that turns
schedule.
into an hour, because,
No, it did awesome.
and we're bonding. Bonding is a good. It took me- Okay, so,
Do you want to schedule anything else past May 11th, or do you want to?
Should we say May 24th? Tuesday after?
I was going to say that too, yes, that was
so
my next one.
May 11th and May 24th, and then, yeah, I don't know beyond that, like,
24th
Ju-
looks good.
June is, thinking about June is too much.
When is the Canopy Lake retreat for all of us?
I don't
Is that on
know.
this?
I have to make sure I'm like,
If we spend ARPA money, we
I
can all
know,
have
I
dinner.
gotta
Hot
look
popcorn.
I
out
thought it
for
was gonna be a
proms
Chris's
and
drink.
things.
Yeah, no, we'll have snow cones at Canopy Lake as a
24th.
as a
11th and
consolation.
24th, yeah.
Well, when are the new
Tuesday,
lights
Tuesday.
going in downtown? We can, is there anything in the area that the group can meet outdoors?
So, yeah, we have the outdoor lights on a field coming up.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
Okay,
It's kind of noisy.
yeah?
Karen has her hand out.
Okay, sure. Karen?
Thank you, Marianne. I'd like to make a motion to adjourn the select board.
Second,
All those in favor? Mark?
yes.
Chris?
Yes,
And Karen, yes. Thank you very much. Have a good
Okay,
night.
yeah, good night.
thanks.
Okay, so I think we have done some things. Check your emails tomorrow for
Homework?
for the agenda and a reminder of what we need for the next meeting.
It's just
And
5.
do we, does anyone have anything else to say before?
Chris.
Go ahead.
No.
Okay. Any further motions for the evening?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Okay, we are adjourned. I get to use
Oh,
the-
gotta vote, gotta vote.
Oh, no.
All in favor?
Favor?
Get ahead of myself. Come on, I'm trying to
Fastest
gavel.
adjourned.
Andrew's opposed over here.